So, hello everybody, and today is our next DecisionCAMP session. We're trying to do this every month or every second month, and today's session is devoted to the latest achievements or changes in the decision model annotation standard. And Denis Gagne was really kind to volunteer to present these changes and talk about this. And I believe Denis is the right person to do it because he is not only a member of DMN task force, he and a very active contributor to this. Denis also represents the product Trisotech, that one of the closest implementation to that really conforms to DMN standards and goes beyond this, like most of vendors do. And so I believe DMN continues to be very topic of interest for the entire decision management community, and I expect that it would be a lot of questions, and I don't want to delay anymore. And Denis, take it over.
Thank you, Jacob. So, as Jacob mentioned, I'm Denis Gagne. I'm the CEO and CTO of Trisotech. We're an implementer of the DMN standard. And today my presentation is going to be a two-part presentation. First, what is new in DMN 1.4, and then a second part, which is really meant to be more of a discussion on what should be beyond DMN 1.4. So let me jump into it, and probably I will ask that you maintain your question till we get to the discussion at the end, just to make sure we go through. I usually prepare way too much material, probably did again, so I'll try to not rush through things. Sorry about that. So first part, what's new in DMN 1.4? So a little bit of setting the history and the context. So DMN version 1 started in 2015, was officially released then, and that was our first version. Then in 2016, we released DMN 1.1, and that was mostly to address DMN XML interchange issues that were in the original release. Then in 2019, we released a major subversion, DMN 1.2, major in the sense that it brought in a lot of things, including the capability of diagram interchange, so the possibility of interchanging the diagram as well as the model, and the introduction of decision service as an invocable element, and the notion of the ellipsis marker, which means when you see an ellipsis marker on something, means that there are more links that exist than what's shown in that particular diagram. Because in DMN, you can have multiple diagrams of the graph of your decision. And so one diagram may be focused on something particular and doesn't show all the details. So the ellipsis is there to mark the fact that you're not seeing everything. And we also introduced the decision table annotations in there, so you could put some commenting along in all the rows of a decision table. Then came out Decision 1.3 in 2021. In DMN 1.3, we tackle the notion of group annotation, so we could put groups that are basically just markers that you put on a diagram. They don't have any semantic real meaning other than annotation on the diagram. We also introduced a full collection of temporal reasoning functions to DMN. That was in 1.3. We also added some context field functions then, and did some good improvements to the typing features of DMN. And now, we're just in the process of releasing DMN 1.4. DMN 1.4 brings in 3 new types of box expressions, also brings in a collection marker on the decisions, and a few new field functions. So hopefully that sets a little bit of history for everybody. So DMN 1.4 was approved by the OMG Architecture Board in last December. It's going through its process now. It's got to be ratified by the general business community. And when that is done, then it goes to the editor to be published. You can find on the OMG website, omg.org/DMN, or I think there's a /spec in between. But we should have an official release sometime in Q1 2022, depending on the stack of the official editor. DMN 1.5 is already in gear. We have a target date of delivery of the report for DMN 1.5 of March 2023. So what's the motivation behind DMN 1.4? Like most revision task force, the motivation is pretty much similar. It's basically to address any gray areas that may still exist in the interpretation of the previous version of the spec. So make sure that we're clear and specific about the specification, and to address any shortcomings that either users have provided or that vendors have experienced. Now, one point that I want to make very important here, OMG and the revision task force, although the work is done by a specific group, it is an open process. So there is a form that you can fill on the OMG website, and you can report issues that you have against any standards, including DMN, and you can go there and put out some issues. Now, one particular trick that you may be wanting to be aware is, while a standard is in its beta stance or status, as DMN 1.4 is in now, any issue received during that period, between the moment it's in beta and the moment that it's fully edited for final, any issue received during that time period is a must address for the revision task force. So if you have things that you want to make sure that the revision task force address, that's the time to go put your issues in through that form. All issues are considered, but in the OMG workings, these issues must be absolutely addressed by the next report. Okay, so what's new? So we introduced in this version 3 new box expressions. So we're augmenting the expressiveness of the visual structure of box expression. The most known box expression by everybody right now is a decision table. That's what people know and like to use. But in DMN, there's a full collection of different box expressions to capture your logic, and we introduced 3 new models. One for conditional, which is basically a structure where you have a conditional branching based on the Boolean criteria. The other one is an iterator, and this is a structure, again, graphical structure. It's a visual way of doing a box expression that we can apply on each element of a collection. And then finally, the filter, which is a graphical representation of filtering on certain expression or lists that are returned. So what does that look exactly? So for conditional, this is what the conditional box expression look like. It's 3 blocks, an if, then, else block. And within each of the block, you can put various box expression or literal expression of field in there. So naturally, the if only offers those that will return a Boolean value, and then in the structure. And as anything else in box expression, context, and all this, this is embeddable. So you can have other box that fits into each of the different box. And I'll show more example next. So for example, where before you would have written, and here the person that wrote that was very nice because he did some pretty printing for us, but your literal expression would look something like that. But if it's all, most of the time, this is all one line without break lines and tabs for clarity. And then it allows you to create a box expression version here. And here in translating it to the box expression, we even went one step further and added a decision table to do some of the logics of the then and else. And the fact of putting a decision table here makes it more visual and was really not possible when you were writing a literal. You were limited to what you could do because the decision table is visual, and within the literal it wasn't clear. So now you have that expressibility. So it's a simple visual way. A lot of people like decision tables, so we're trying to make it so you can put decision table just about anywhere you want. The next box expression is the iterator. The iterator is built around the notion, and really we call it the iterator as a single box expression, but there's 3 box expression really, where we cover the for in return, but you also cover the every in satisfies or the sum in satisfies, and the drop downs here, the tickers, that's the particular Trisotech interface for it, but other vendors will have different interface. But it's a way, again, of visualizing an iteration expression in there. So for example, if you have something like this literal expression for loan in a series of loans, so for a particular loan in a collection of loans, return the rate calculation, which is an invocation of a function, passing these parameters. So when you transfer all this into a box expression, it becomes much more visual. And we know that business people can read this readily, quickly, saying, okay, for loan in loans, then invoke the rate calculation with these 3 parameters. Filters. Filters is basically modeled after the square brackets that we have in field. It allows you to contain 2 blocks. So basically, and each of them can have various elements. So here, if you have something like a literal expression, which may be complicated for some people to read here and understand the logic of a loan where the collection is loans, and I'm filtering out those loans that the amount is more than 100,000 and the period is greater than 5 years. Now, when you use the filter, it creates the box with those 2 brackets, and it allows you again to become more visual. So here I can put a context in here where I'm defining some quote unquote local variable or some names that are within the context. And then I can say, well, I'm looking at the list of loans. Out of this, I have some large loan, I have some long-term loan. Return the filter of the large loan and long-term loan. So again, it's a visual, much more visual, following the path of decision table to simplify visualization of logic to end users. So what's the benefits of these new box expression? It allows us to stay within the context of box expression, to stay visual and more abstract. It also allows us to reuse some business-friendly constructs, such as the decision tables, some iteration, filters, which you can all do. Well, not everything was exactly possible in the literal expression, because putting a decision table in a literal expression is doable, but you got to be quite a craft agent of DMN, because then you would have to put a context definition within that, and those are pretty advanced topic. And our goal is to do the opposite, is to make it more simple for business users. So here's an example. This is a financial example, and to show, I'm also putting in here something that came from before, the notion of annotation. So in DMN now, visually, we have the double line, the double blue line here. It's a little bit small, and the intent is not necessarily for you to read, but at the top here, that's my comments. That's my annotation documentation of what this is supposed to do. This is called, this is calculating the initial margin on a basket of different financial resources. And then you can see for my initial margin that I'm iterating over a list. And then here for my gross margin, here's the text. And this is actually taken out of a regulation document that exists in the US. So this sentence is literal, and the paragraph above are literal statement from the regulation. And then you can see the field version of this in a sense. So here, for example, here's my documentation that explains what this is. And then you can see another iterator. And here I'm using, again, my documentation above the 2 line. And then you can see my bit. So I could show you, I don't have it, but if I've shown you this as a single literal expression or even as a series of literal expression in the context, it would look like code to you. Where here, unfortunately, it's too small, but I can provide you the example if you want. Here, it reads like documentation. It is clear and visually obvious to a business end user. Certainly, I would argue that, and that's the feedback we're getting. So that's it for the box expression that were introduced in 1.4. 1.4 also introduced a new collection marker. So we already had a collection marker on the data inputs, which was to signify that this input was a collection. We did the same on decision. We put a marker and we put it at the top to really say that this decision returns a collection. So this doesn't mean that this decision iterates. It doesn't mean that this decision does anything in terms of its behavior. It just means that the result of this decision is going to be a collection. And as you're doing more and more DMN and you start dealing with collections, this information on your DRD is very interesting. And even if you're not doing the logic, to be able to grasp from a DRD, a visual DRD, you know, where there are collection involved and where the data is being worked over is very insightful. Okay, now jumping into some new fill functions. So this is a somewhat, I won't say controversial, but this is a departure a little bit for the RTF. We've introduced the now and today function. And the reason we introduced these two functions is because basically every vendor had a version of this, although it wasn't in the spec. And the reason it wasn't in the spec is that these functions may break one of the DMN goal rule of returning the same results, giving the same inputs. And when you start having these kind of functions, then you cannot guarantee this. But given that every vendor had those functions, we wanted to standardize it so that at least when you interchange your file, each vendor used the same name for these. And then we suggested clearly in the spec that a good practice for this is to provide the current date as an input. If you want to make sure that you maintain that execution of that decision, given the same input, give you the same output, then a good practice is to put your current date as an input. Now, it may not be important to you, and therefore you may use these functions. Certainly, our users make big use of this, and I know the users or all the different vendors also make big use of these functions, so we decided to standardize them. Another set of functions that were introduced in this version are context level functions. This is falling into much more advanced DMN, I would say, where you're playing with the notion of the context here, and we've shown different examples. So we have a context, which you can create a context based on some key value that you provide. So that's creating a context. And we have a context put, where you can actually create a new context that includes the new entry or overriding the entry. And we have a context merge that creates a new context that includes all entries from a given context. So in here, you have 3 examples. I've put them here in a context box to show the example rather than writing 3 separate examples, but they're there and showing you the results. Another set of new field functions that were introduced are around the notion of rounding. So the first thing that was done is that we added a new signature for floor and ceiling that added an extra parameter so that you can add basically a scale so that you can now, as the example shows here, if you're doing the floor of 1.56, the answer would be 1. But you can also now say floor of 156, 1, and that will give you 1.5. So it's a second signature for the same function. We also introduced a series of other rounding methods, round up, round down, round half up, and round half down. And this granularity was introduced from our financial service type of customers and users that needed that more precise functional values and control. And so these functions were introduced to help those that are doing more work with financial rounding of numbers. Although they can be used in any domain, but that's certainly where the motivation came from. Our friends from Goldman Sachs had a lot of requirement around this need. We also added a new fill function around manipulating text. The new function is called string join, and this function was added with use 2 parameters, a collection of strings to be joined, and an optional delimiter character. So for example, if I do a string join of this list and I use this delimiter, I get as a result this string divided by that delimiter that I specify. The details and all the variation that you can do are explained in the spec, but that gives you a sense of what this, again, very useful when you're doing different real world situation and models. So that was my presentation of what's new in DMN 1.4. It's a good set of features that were added to DMN. I think they move us in the right direction. And now I'd like to jump into setting up the stage for discussion. So I'll throw in a bunch of discussion points. These are my personal views. They're not the RTF views. They're not anybody else's than my own views. But I'm throwing them there as a discussion point. And once after that, then people can, you know, challenge or add more to what I've said, because the whole idea is to get feedback from the community. So setting the stage a little bit, for those of you that may not be aware, already in DMN, so as of DMN 1.4 or even as of DMN 1.3, we already have the capability of expressing decision requirements via DRDs, which are decision requirement diagrams. We also have the simplification of the decision logic via box expression, which we enlarge that simplification with 1.4. We have the uniformity of execution via field, and we have the notion of invocation of user functions defined within DMN. We also can invoke predictive models, which are to be, let me be du jour, AI, because people seem to think now that AI is machine learning and predictive models, but that wasn't the definition in my days. But anyway, that seems to be the definition. But we have that capability within DMN to invoke predictive models and use those predictions right within the model. We also have in DMN the capability of invoking Java methods and classes in there. So that's already there. And we also already have the support for temporal reasoning in DMN. So maybe people are not quite aware that all this already exists in DMN. So looking forward for DMN 1.5, again, personal input. One thing that I can see of interest in this version is correcting or improving the compliance categories of DMN. Right now, it's been pretty much thrown in there loosely. It's even referencing a full chapter that's been deprecated on SFIL. So it really needs to be revamped. Bruce Silver already posted a blog post on what he thinks DMN compliance level should be. And I know that the DecisionAutomation.org group has the DMN on-ramp, which is looking at pretty much the same road as redefining what could be good compliance categories for DMN. So that's something that we'd like to have feedback, and your feedback can come in through the issue at OMG. It's a way of also, specifying your issues and specifying what you need and want there. Another big point that I've been hearing a lot from different vendors and from different clients is the possibility of allowing external libraries of built-in functions. So right now, DMN comes with its set of building function, but it'd be also interesting to see how we can bring in external libraries. Now, I'm not specifying here how this would be done, whether these libraries would be completely external or whether these libraries would be defined as libraries with the field semantic and pulled in. I'm not going that direction. I'm just saying that's an idea. Certainly, two things that I would be interested in seeing more is linear algebra, everything that has to do with matrix manipulation, because if you have to deal with linear algebra and DMN right now, you have to build yourself a whole set. It's possible to do it, but you have to build your own set of user functions that does the matrix manipulation, and it's not really efficient and effective. So we could certainly bring a lot of benefits there. Predictive analytics, there's more and more interest about data analytics. So we could think of bringing in things like similar to the library that R offers. So again, not discussing how it would happen, but that's certainly interesting. Another little thing, but that would save a lot of headaches, is the possibility to enter range as input. Because right now, if you want to say something is happening within the range and that's your input, you have to define two input data objects, one for the start and one for the end. It'd be interesting, but once it's in, we can manipulate that structure. We just cannot input that structure directly. So I think that's something that we should certainly address. Other area of interest could be dealing with units of measures. A lot of different industries have to deal with unit of measures and conversion from measures to measures. Yes, we still have conversion of units of measure these days. Another point, that's my personal pet peeve, so but I had to put it there. I'd like for us to start looking at dealing with temporal granularity, which in my old days in the 80s when I was doing AI was called common sense reasoning, and this temporal reasoning, so that we could compare something like 4:30 in the afternoon, the 1st of January 2022, with the 3rd of February. So we certainly can tell that the 3rd of February is later than the 1st of January 2022 at 16:30. Now, there are possibilities of logic that we can do based on that. It requires some more work. That's certainly something that I would be interested in seeing, so we can go a little bit further in the temporal reasoning that we've done in 1.3. So what value does DMN provide? And this is where I'm starting to color outside the line or taking a discussion position. So I think the first value that DMN provides is visually specified decision requirements and logic. So a user or a person can quickly visually grasp what the requirement and what the logic of a decision is. So we can do the requirement with a DRD, and which can visualize the logic with box expression. Uniform skill set. That's probably the biggest winner there, I think, in the market, is that any skilled DMN person can read and understand a DMN compliant model. And that skill transportation is very important for our clients and organization in general, because when that guy that did all those DMN model leave the organization, you can hire another person that was trained in DMN, and he will be able to read and follow through with that. He doesn't have to learn the specific of Trisotech or the specific of any other vendors. DMN is the standard and these models, and that's a very important skill for our customers and our clients in general. Another benefit is the uniform file format, which means that any DMN tool can open and edit a DMN file compliant. And that's very important so that there's no vendor lock-in and that our users can go from vendor to vendor. And the spec is made so that even if you don't support all of the feature of DMN, you can still interchange the portion that you interchange, and even the extension that a vendor adds in. The golden rule between vendors is that any tool should be able to open any DMN model with extension from a specific vendor and just ignore them and then return them back when you export. So what we call this playing nice with the other vendors is if a vendor adds some extension in their file, we take them in, and then when we re-export, we re-export the vendor extension, so that file is still valid on the source vendor platform. And the last one is also very important in my view. It's uniform execution, and which says that any DMN engine will provide the same output given the same input. I think that's important because if I create a DMN model that calculates whatever, a BMI score, a body mass index score, but I want to make sure that when I run that same model on an IBM platform, a Trisotech platform, a Red Hat platform, whatever the platform, that given the same input, I'll get the same output, because that's why I'm using a standard, not just for the drawings, but also for the behavior. So those are certainly what I consider the 4 value contribution of DMN. Now, you may not be interested in all 4 of them, and that's okay, but DMN does provide all 4. So what does that mean? It means that to me, when somebody say DMN, to me, this is Denis Gagne, DMN means DRD plus box expression plus field, because that's how we achieved the 4 value statement that I had in the previous slides. If you remove field from there, then there's no way for us to guarantee that the execution semantic will be there. If you remove the DRD, then you're lacking the expression that is needed of the requirement. So to me, it's an all-inclusive, but I understand that some people may be interested in just part of that and very open to supporting that with the spec. So the $2,000 question is DMN 2.0 on the horizon. A little bit of context: revision task force within OMG are limited to dot versions. And what that really means is that we have to maintain backward compatibility. So that's kind of the measure, the gauge we use to say, okay, should that be done there or not? It's about maintaining backward compatibility as much as possible. Now, a new version in the OMG process require a full cycle of an RFP, a request for proposal. And usually that will be preceded by a request for information, RFI. So you can imagine that when we say, okay, we're going to do DMN 2.0, we put out an RFI. We got to give 3 to 6 months to people to respond to the RFI. Once the RFI answers are in, we have to analyze the answer and then move all these answers into a common RFP, request for proposal. Once the request for proposal is written, then we have to make it publicly available and wait another 3 to 6 months, sometime maybe even a year, to collect all the proposal from all the different interested parties. And then once we have all the proposal, then the cycle of a finalization task force can be started, which may take, as short as 3 months or as long as 3 to 5 years. So fundamentally, this is a big take on for a group to do. And that's probably why right now there's no DMN 2.0 on the horizon, although it is a possibility. And that was my full intro to what's new in DMN 1.4 and topic of discussion. Certainly would love to entertain questions or comments or people disagreeing with me. Have fun.
Okay, Denis, thank you very much. That's really very right to the point presentation, and that's what I always like when you do presentation. You're not afraid to put yourself in position to criticize. And we do have in chat, if you look, 2 questions. But probably the first question from Gediminas summarize many people want to ask about iterators. That's probably one of the most impressive suggestions in DMN 1.4. And how about embedded loops? Maybe you can show us, we couldn't see big examples. Maybe you can show us larger examples if you have it. And then we will talk, and Gediminas may ask more questions.
Yeah, so depending on who you talk within the DMN community, you will have different answers. So fundamentally, DMN is and FEEL, most specifically FEEL, is a functional language, and it's a functional expression language. It's not a programming language. So it doesn't have the notion of some notion that programming language would require. But it does have some expressions that resemble the workings of programming statement. For example, the for iterator. So that was already part of DMN. So that was already part of FEEL. So nothing was introduced there. It was just a visualization of that. So in terms of scope, nothing was enlarged there. Now, if other scopes are of interest to people, again, the RTF feature or issue document is the way to really bring those forwards, and it will be considered by the RTF. But right now, we're divided within the group on, and I know that, I don't know if Matteo is on the call, but Matteo and some folks at Red Hat did some exercise to demonstrate that FEEL is, and I'm not sure if they showed there was Turing complete, or anyway, they did some work to move the needle on that. So if you're interested in the theory of expression language and programming languages, different people will give you different lines on that. And certainly, I would point at Matteo Matari from Red Hat, because I know he blogged a few blog posts on these notions. So you may want to talk with him.
So the question was more specific about if 1.4 allows embedded loops, embedded iterators.
Jacob, I would like to clarify. Actually, the question was related to very concrete screenshot, which Denis was showing, where he was showing that if expression was allowing in its condition part to put an iterator. So I'm wondering, because let's say if I embed the literal expression context or a decision table, it can all return me a Boolean value, which is makes sense. The question stands, what happens if in if expression, not in iterator, Denis, if you go to the if statement. Yeah, this one, yeah. What happens if I provide in the if expression the iterator, which returns me a multiple Boolean values? Does it mean that this if expression will be evaluated as many times as there are Boolean values returned by iterator? Actually, the relevant screenshot is one slide before this.
Yeah,
yes.
No, I think the syntax validation and the field syntax will force you that this has to be a simple type of Boolean. It cannot be a collection of Boolean. Okay, so here iterator assumes that only one value would be returned. Is that correct? Yeah, and I don't. Yeah, that would have to be the case. And somebody else could correct me on that if I'm saying something wrong, but yes. To the best of my understanding, this needs to resolve to Boolean. And it actually, the type is there. So this has got to be of type Boolean. So it cannot be a list of Boolean.
Yeah. Okay. So because Iterator assumes that there could be a list of values.
Yeah. Well, no, and it could and it could not. So again,
I agree.
And this is probably a drawback of the tool in the sense that the tool has to allow you to do things and then will block you when this is not returning the correct type for that particular box.
Okay, many thanks. I was wondering whether in the standard was slightly extended semantics, but you have answered the question. Thank you.
Okay, good.
But you also ask, and I wonder, if inside iterator, can I call another iterator?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that you can do. We have customer example of pretty deep integration of iterators and conditional going into a deep logic. Some people are doing some very advanced logic. So we have an example where one of our customer is doing what we would consider AI, natural language processing in DMN. And so basically they're just iterating through the text that is provided, tokenizing, and then identifying. So yeah, so this can become, but the benefit is that exactly that is that very complex logic is visually, you can see the structure of what's going on. Even if you don't read code, you can see the structure, the architecture of the expression that's made there.
Okay, I will ask later questions, but somebody else, I can see Rimantas has question.
Yeah, somebody made a comment that now can be extremely dangerous. Yes, we agree. And yes, and that's why we said that if you use that, be warned. Our goal there was to make sure that given that every single vendor that are part of this effort add a version of now and today, we figured we may as well standardize the function call and the, but agree, and yes, it's a very good practice to have the current date and current time as an input. So yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, from our side, the anti-pattern story would be that those functions were introduced, and when a lot of business rules were developed which use those functions, and then we run into problems that we cannot test it them predictably, we cannot ensure that they will be evaluated correctly, and now we are in a position where we try to refactor infrastructure. So basically, we would provide a wrapper around those functions. So yeah, I guess the pressure from the business is to add this functionality, but it's often not evaluated correctly about possible dangers.
Yeah, and a lot of us that are vendors, our purpose is to provide the tools that our customer require. So there's always a gray line between saying to the customer, I don't care that you need that, you're not going to get it. They're going to go to the next guy that offers it. And the proof in the pudding was that every single vendor had those two functions. So we just decided to standardize the name of the function at least and the signature.
Okay. Any other questions?
I thought I would get more comments or more question on the notion of what is DMN, because that's usually where the push or the discussion sparks. Yeah. Is that a lot of people will say, well, DMN is just the DRD, or DMN is just DRD and decision table. So I'd like certainly to discuss with people, because again, this is useful input, because as we're discussing, we're bringing this back to our discussion, what the feedback is from the community at large.
Yeah. You can discuss this, of course. Denis, you raised hand.
Yes, actually, I have a question about the future in DMN. So it all started with box expressions, and decision table was the most famous first one. I'm just wondering, because it all originated from business rules approach, and in the standard there is no box expression for the general rules. That actually we are forced to create those, let's say, traditional rules in decision tables, but your decision tables may get heavily fragmented if each rule has a unique condition and its expression. So basically my question is, are there any plans to add other visual box expressions for things like rule sets? This is one. The second idea could be, for example, for scorecards. Again, it can be done with decision tables, but it's, in my opinion, it looks like a workaround. It's not that much user-friendly. And I'm not sure about the decision trees. Mm-hmm.
So let me address the first one. So the market progressed from a notion of rule-based to decision-based, but it's not necessarily the case, and again, my own personal opinion, that DMN was meant to recapture the rule world. It was meant to start from decision and then see what the best practice are to provide decision. So that's a little bit of a nuance there. Now, the notion of decision or rule sets is somewhat, and again, somewhat encapsulated in the notion of BKMs and or the notion of decision service, which is a way of encapsulating your quote unquote rules or your expressions that are providing a certain logic. So these are there in that format. It was never our goal, and I don't think it will ever be our goal, to take what was done in the decision rule, in the rule management world, and translate it one-to-one into DMN. So we took, it's the same, I always take the same analogy, it's the same dog, we can take it by the ears or we can take it by the tail, but it's the same dog. But when you take it from the ears and when you take it from the tail, you get a different view. So we took it from the decision point of view as opposed to the rule point of view. So that's one thing there. But if there are, again, rule construct that people are used to use that would be useful, again, bring them forward. We're interested in making this as flexible and useful for people. And I don't recall what the last thing was.
The other forms of logic expression, and Dennis, just to clarify, that was not that much opposing to the decision approach, which is perfectly clear to me. It was more the question about the different forms of expressing the particular kind of logic. And there could be that, for example, a rule set, a traditional rule set, is just visually better than the decision table, or, for example, scorecard. Again, you can express it in decision table, but it does not look like nice, like there are plenty of scorecard examples available from different vendors. And the third example was decision tree. Yet again, this is yet another form of expressing your logic. So my question was, is there any plans to add other forms of boxed expressions to express logic in these forms?
There's no plans, but we're certainly open to it. And in general, calling this different set of logic was brought in by one of your colleagues, as Alan Fish, that brought in the notion of BKM, which was exactly for that purpose, so that you can have logic that is encapsulated, that is external, encapsulated and provided into the DMN environment. So that's already there. Right now, the standard supports these logic to be expressed, yes, in field, but also in Java or in PMML. You may say, well, it'd be great if, and tool vendor can do what they want, but if you want to say, well, it'd be great to have also this as a potential type of logic to be embedded in there. Again, everything goes on the table. It's discussed with the group, and then we try to get a resolution.
Many thanks.
Okay, Derek.
Hi, Jacob, Denis. Good to see you both again. Listen, I suppose that
Eric, I have an issue with you. I have an issue with you. Well, my hair keeps getting grayer and yours doesn't change.
Yeah, it's because my wife cuts it off every weekend. Then that's why. That way it looks the same. No, seriously. Good job. And technical discussions aside, to me, the biggest challenge really around DMN is the sort of still, I don't know, have we got the killer app yet for DMN? Do we have the breakthrough, if you like, at the marketing level where it reaches the consciousness where it starts to take off? I can see you bashing a drum in healthcare. I see, some stuff going on in finance, and I'm sure the banks like Goldman and what have you are all over this in the sense of saying that. But, I suppose for me, it's the regulator almost. It's those sort of folks starting to express themselves. Do we see, and now it's more a general discussion point, if you like, do we see uptake from those sort of bodies in terms of starting to say, here's my PDF regulation and compliance deck. Oh, and by the way, here's the executable version of that 600-page PDF, right? Pick and choose your bits, and I want to inspect all your trades that go through with that. Is there any evidence of that sort of thing happening yet, or is it just, am I just blowing smoke?
No, there is. So there is, but it's a slow-moving train. So, for example, in the financial industry, the Mortgage Banker Association, through its standard body, which is called MISMO, have adopted DMN as their language for specifying decision. That took place 2 years ago. And now they're in the process of adopting BPMN to specify their processes. So there is some movement of that where, and as you may know, a group like MISMO have a lot of the financial regulators, the Fannie Mae, the GSC, and all these guys are all involved in there. So they're all using it, but they're still at the experimentation level. They're not yet at the, let's move this into production and obligation. So there is movement in that direction. It's slow coming. Naturally, people complain that OMG is a slow process to get things through. These GSC or these governance type of organization are even slower than what OMG can be. But there is that awareness, and there's another movement that is somewhat parallel but related that I've been involved myself in. That's called rules as code, and I know there's a movement that's talking about capturing laws and regulation using rules, whether it's rule or decision. Again, there's some confusion in the market as to what the difference is, and maybe the difference shouldn't matter in the end. So there is movement, but it's still coming.
Yeah.
But I'm with you. We're still in an early adopter market. I mean, there's no question about it. We're nowhere near the fact that everybody uses DMN. But then again, I would argue that although BPMN is spread all over the world and deep, BPMN is still an early adopter market.
And it's still skin deep.
Exactly.
And one other quick question for you, maybe as a follow-on. The relationship, if you like, between DMN, these sort of operational standards, and business architecture, sort of other things that you do. Do you see customers linking that? Do you see people actually thinking about those two worlds? This is my operating model. Here I've described the pieces of it. Here are my processes. Oh, I've got this category of things called policies, and what have you, and actually starting to grapple with it in that sort of top-down boutique strategy sort of way. Is that happening at all?
Yeah, let me just slide in, because Vincent, and I don't know your last name correctly, Vincent, sorry, but Vincent made a comment in the chat to you saying that in the Netherlands, there's 350 governing bodies that are using DMN to specify their permits. And Vincent, feel free to inject.
I think we may have had a conversation about this before, Vincent, when I was in a previous life.
Yeah, I think you did.
Or was it Vincent? Someone like that. I don't know. I can't remember the names.
Yeah. So going back to your last question on, let me pedal back in my brain now. You were talking about the. Help me there.
I suppose the relationship to business architecture and the sort of these concepts. If I think about the world and business enterprise architecture and all those sort of guys, this has got to be one of the components of that world, and yet it's not in this. The people in Gartner are completely unaware, and Forrester for that matter.
There's more and more in that direction. A lot of people that are quote unquote placing their bet on DMN or BPMN and DMN and CMMN or whatever, a lot of them are actually integrating this completely in their biz DevOps cycle, and even biz DevSecOps, if you want to use buzzword to the limit. So a lot of the organization are seeing this as a key part of operationalizing what their business logic and their business goals are and how to achieve them. So there's more and more, and certainly we see that from a Trisotech point of view, but I'm sure Jacob sees that from his customers and others that are on the call, that this notion of completely integrating this as part of a biz DevOps chain is a big movement right now. They want to make sure that you have your product owner or your application owner that specify their logic, and that there's a direct stream all the way down to what is published outside to the world. And hopefully this is built on some higher level architecture, but then that depends on the tooling. At Trisotech, we start all the way from strategy to operation. Others are right into the operation. It depends on the tooling.
Yeah, I suppose my point in a way is more continuation of the work I did at Gartner and trying to sort of roll it into this idea of digital ops or whatever it was going to be called. It never really sort of resonated enough to get people excited, right? So, and that's back to the point of I'm just saying some of those things just didn't quite happen.
Derek, probably I can express opinion of multiple decisioning platforms vendors who deal with real customers. Situation is dramatically changed in last 4 or 5 years with active movement to cloud and introduction of decision microservices. So when we work with huge customers, maybe they don't know initially the word DMN, but they know still what rule engine. And what's happening, their real teams now consist of mainly business experts and 1-2 programmers who comes from what DevOps teams. It's not anymore even IT, it's always DevOps. And now business people very quickly develop their own quite complex business applications, and because they love this technology with externalized business rules and decisions and combining them in like Lego, building from small Legos specific decision services, and deployment becomes obvious now. It's just a choice of platform, and power of decisioning platforms grows dramatically, and we can see it's everywhere, and people quite aware. We come to customers who already tried IBM or rules or open rules or Trisotech, and I believe every vendor can tell you the same story. But it's life is different these days than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, but I think what Derek was getting at is that that's at the edge. At the edge of the operations, we go to the technology, but going backward a little bit from the actual goal of the organization, and how these strategic goals are as basically ends of the organization are met by the means of the organization, which are met by these
and all those things. Maybe Vincent, I know the work that you're involved in with the Dutch environmental thing. That's, I think, a really good example. It'd be really good to hear what challenges you had in engaging the business people into that conversation.
Well, the biggest challenge was to find the people to be able to translate the legal rules into a DMN kind of logic, because there aren't that many analysts or business analysts who are able to.
Right.
And when people start, they think, well, this is very complicated. But we see that if they are trained a little, then DMN can really help them to think about decisions and the layers of decisions and what inputs will be needed for decisions. So I totally agree that the combination of the DRD and decision tables is a very powerful instrument to specify decisions.
And by the way, people who are not familiar with this could find Vincent's presentation at the last DecisionCAMP, at DecisionCAMP YouTube channel. And may I still, before we finish, Denis, I know that we're telling the world that DMN does not do programming, and that's fine. But you still introduced today, for many people, first time, the concept of Iterator. And in your Iterator, you said it is for in return. But if it's already in this territory, did you consider for in until or break?
No, because and the reason we didn't is because we only stick to what was already in the execution semantic of field. So we didn't introduce anything new. So the for statement, the if statement were already in DMN since version 1.0. So these have always been there. So we just provided a visualization of this. But if we want to expand those behavior with while loops or all kinds of other construct, the good way is to suggest it to the RTF, and it's going to be revised there.
I just wonder, maybe you already discussed the visualization of such things as break, or in particular visualization of concept of index that's already inside the DMN.
Yeah, so we have the notion of index in DMN at different places. That was introduced in 1.3.
Yeah, I just wonder if you found nice graphical representation of this. That's because that's one of the very interesting new knowledge what came from this webinar. Okay, probably not, and it will be done in the future. And it's really great that the DMN actually, you can see the DMN task force is listening community, and they respond to requests from trenches, and they really do serious improvements, and that's a great thing. And Denis, thank you very much for presenting this, and it was very enlightening. And we're going to publish this presentation on the DecisionCAMP YouTube channel, probably in the next few hours. And I also want to ask everybody, you can see discussion with Vincent, probably he would present on one of the upcoming session. If you want to present, just let me know. And we still have a lot of time until DecisionCAMP, that, by the way, would be held in September with our hosts, Declarative AI, in this time in Berlin. But September 12, September 14, that's our dates, and the website should be available in a week. And stay in touch. And thank you, everybody, for participation.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.